Good morning. Welcome to the third and final day of Belgrade Security Conference. On the very beginning, we will be dealing with Good Friday Agreement, 25 years since it was struck. What challenges it represents today, what Brexit brought to this agreement, and what conclusions can be drawn from it for the conflicts all across the world and especially in this region. The speakers in this panel will be Peter Shirlow, Director of University of Liverpool's Institute of Irish Studies. Mr. Shirlow will be joining us online. Sally Axworthy, Head of Negotiations and Peace Processes Department, UK Government's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. And Mr. David Cooney, former career diplomat of the Irish Foreign Office. This panel will be moderated by Sofija Todorović, Program Director of Youth Initiative for Human Rights. Please take the floor.
Okay, so I think that we have a really easy topic for this early morning. So I will actually, without further ado, start by maybe asking a question and trying to introduce everyone into the topic that we'll be jointly discussing today. In the very beginning, in the introduction, actually we said that it's 25 years since the agreement was made, and actually it put an end to a violence that was happening for, well, 30 and something years, if we take the formal start of the Troubles as 1960s. And then we had this agreement that is usually widely perceived as a success. And I would really like that we discuss this further to see why is it a success, and are there still some things that should be discussed or emphasized, and challenges that could be overcome in the future. So since we all know that the agreements do not fall from the sky, in a way. And in 1998, actually, when the agreement was reached, it was a multi-party agreement, if I agreed. So it actually included wider scale, actually, of actors who somehow joined and participated in the agreement itself. It was also followed by 2 referendums. But I'm maybe curious to know now, what were the efforts that were made towards reaching the agreement before the agreement itself? What do you see as the preconditions that were already there on the ground? And what do you see as efforts that enabled that this agreement actually lives now for 25 years, even though maybe at that moment that was not that everybody actually believed? So maybe I will start with Sally.
Thank you. So I can mention some of the factors. There were lots of factors, and I'm sure my colleagues will mention others. So, I mean, I think we talk a lot about ripeness for an agreement. So perhaps this was a moment when the parties felt that they were not achieving their aims by other means, and they were ready to contemplate negotiations. But then there was also a lot of work that went into the agreement even before the multi-party negotiations. So many of the ideas, or many of the kind of core features of the Belfast Good Friday Agreement were worked out many years before. So, for example, the Sunningdale Agreement of 1973 had, established the idea of power sharing. I mean, that agreement was not a success, but the idea of power sharing was established then. And in the series of agreements, the Downing Street Declaration and the agreements that ran up to the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, much of the substance was worked out, but what wasn't there was maybe the political will to make this agreement. I think for me, the thing that really changed the nature of the negotiations was making them inclusive, and so inclusive in different ways. I mean, bringing Sinn Féin into the negotiations was obviously key, because you had to have the parties, all the parties, there to be able to make the deal. You couldn't make the deal without them. But also the talks were inclusive in other ways. So, for example, there was the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition that was part of the multi-party talks, and they were a different sort of group. They were cross-community. They were focused particularly on victims. And so they were bringing a different perspective. And I think they played, I was not part of the negotiations, unlike my colleague, but I think they played an important role in bringing a different focus, arguing from a different point of view. So I mentioned these couple of elements and perhaps leave others to explore other elements.
Actually, you now mentioned this part about the women and, for example, the role of women associations of victims, if I understood correctly, in the process. But my feeling when I was in Northern Ireland was that the main actors in this process before the agreement and after the agreement were not just like the victims, like civilian victims, but also fighters. So maybe to elaborate that and to actually reflect on that, I will maybe now go to David and ask also if he can add what was this conflict about, between whom, because we usually here make parallels between the conflicts that we have here in the Balkans, but I would really like to that we go into depth of this conflict. What was it about?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, the conflict would go back to the partition of Ireland in 1921, and where you basically had two states being established. One which was established specifically on a sectarian head count, 2 to 1, in Northern Ireland, in favour of Protestantism. It was established on the basis of being a state that would maintain as a state where the Protestant community would basically be in control. On the other side of the border, you had a state that, as a result of partition, effectively became a state dominated by the Catholic Church and the whole ethos of Catholicism. So the two parts of Ireland grew fundamentally apart. The actual trigger for the conflict was really civil rights issues, because there was endemic discrimination against the Catholic community in the north. It was self-governing, to be frank and fair to the British government. They largely left Northern Ireland to get on with itself. Britain had an awful lot of other distractions, not least a world war and many other colonial issues. So you had fairly systematic discrimination in terms of employment, human rights, housing, voting, and this led to protests in the late 60s that quickly developed into, if you like, an intercommunal conflict with the police, which were very much dominated by the Protestant community. The British Army went in to try and restore order, and then that quickly developed into a conflict in which nationalist forces, the IRA, started, if you like, a campaign of violence against the British Army with a view to getting the British Army to withdraw from Northern Ireland. You had, as Sally has mentioned, long efforts to establish a political process, the Sunningdale Agreement as early as 1973. None of these agreements worked as much as anything because they were partial. Those who were involved in violence were outside the process. So the Good Friday Agreement, if you like, brought together the political and the, I can say military, if you like, but it sought to resolve at one single go in a comprehensive way the political issues and the issue of political violence. And as of now, it's probably been more successful in terms of ending violence than it has to resolving all the political issues, because I'm very much aware I'm here talking about the Good Friday Agreement at a moment where the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement are more or less in abeyance as a result of the outworkings of Brexit.
Maybe now is the time also to include Peter, actually. So Peter, do you think that the political will was the key for reaching the agreement, or you think that there were also other preconditions that contributed that we have actually that political will in that moment of time?
Okay, thank you very much, and apologies I can't be with you. I have my own global disorder, which is COVID. one of the things I think was really, really important to say here is the vast majority of people in Northern Ireland never supported violence. And I think it's also very important to make it clear that the vast majority of victims of the conflict were civilians. And there was, despite what groups claimed, that was always the case. And it was also always the case that people, even within the paramilitary groups, loyalists, those who wish to remain in Northern Ireland, and Republicans, those who wish to unite Ireland, did not have higher levels of support, did not have the high levels of support that they claimed. I think there are several things that brought about the peace process, one of which was security. Basically, the non-state actors, the paramilitary groups, were highly infiltrated by the British state, and in terms of people who were informants and were passing information back to the state. The state was able to, for example, tamper with weapons, and through those informants, they were able to, for example, to disarm Semtex. They were able to disarm weaponry. So they actually made the capacity of engaging in violence much less capable. And I think that's crucially important. There was a security aspect here. It was a very, at times, pernicious aspect of the conflict, because some of those informants were also at the same time murdering people. But I think the main thing is proven by what's happened in Northern Ireland. So the argument I would make is it was never a conflict to which the majority of people subscribed. Today we have, for example, since 1972, for example, the police seized 20,000 kilograms of explosives. Last year, the police seized 1 kilogram. There's been a 90% decline in conflict-related violence. There's been a 65% decline in sectarian violence. Belfast is now a major tourist site. When I was young and a car pulled up behind you, the steps you would take were big ones. When a car pulls up behind you in Belfast now, it's probably a tourist who's lost. Belfast is the 7th best performing economy in the UK. It is only bettered by regions around London and in London. We are the biggest site for foreign direct investment in fintech, and we are a world leader in cybersecurity. In 1998, the year of the Belfast Agreement, we did a survey of citizens of Northern Ireland. 33% believed that the other side were victims. Today, that is 78% across all communities. So one of the other things that has happened in Northern Ireland has been the breaking down of the binary, Catholic, Protestant, United Ireland, staying in the UK. We have seen this politically. Nearly 1 in 5 people now vote for non-constitutional parties. We have more relationships across the sectarian divide, adult relationships. So the success of the Good Friday Agreement is proven in the fact that the majority of people wanted to get on with their lives. They wanted safety, they wanted security, they wanted prosperity. And I think it's very important to also point out that the violence was not between communities. A lot of paramilitary violence was upon its own community. For example, 1/5 of the IRA's victims were Catholics, and 1/5 of loyalist victims were Catholics. So the binary is not a reality. It was a level of violence, especially in deprived working class communities, that people simply did not want to live through.
May I have one follow-up question? Was that the lack of willingness actually of people to get engaged into violent action? Was that maybe the reason why the referendum actually was held after the agreement? So we had April 1989, the agreement, and then we had like referendums held in Northern Ireland and Ireland, because usually when we discuss about this kind of the agreements that should put an end to a conflict, at least, and I'm again going from this regional perspective here in the Balkans, we always talk about the referendums before this. So we have like the suggestion of the agreement, then we ask people on referendum, and then if people say yes, then we accept it. Why in Northern Ireland was somehow different?
Well, it came after, the point that Sally made. Came after very long, protracted negotiations, which brought the main actors and also those who were representative of peace and moving Northern Irish society on. I think you've got to realise that, the talks had to go the way they did, and the referendum had to come afterwards because there had to be a lot of confidence building. As you know, conflicts are incredibly intimate. The majority of us had a friend or a family member killed in the conflict, and aspects of the conflict included things which I agreed with, the release of political prisoners. And it had to be a package that had to be put together, a bit like a box of chocolates. Some of us like this type of chocolate, some of us like that type of chocolate. Because, I think if we were honest, anybody who voted for that agreement, there was some aspect in that agreement that you didn't like. But I go back to my point, which I think is the critical point. Civil society in Northern Ireland did not want there to be a conflict. Trade unions, women's groups, peace groups, the churches, general, 5/8, as we would say, normal people just simply did not want to live through this conflict. It was a conflict that was targeted at civilians. The point you made earlier on, very few paramilitaries died in our conflict compared to the number of civilians or members of the security forces. And I think also there was a great desire to disentangle, because men probably in the 65 to 75 age range, a quarter of those men in Northern Ireland were either paramilitaries or members of the security forces. That had a major impact upon people's family lives. It had a major impact upon the way in which society operated. And I think the referendum had to come after the negotiations, because we really had to put together a range of competing interests. And one of the things that really helped here was when the Irish state removed its claim over Northern Ireland as a territory of Ireland. That was symbolic. So the framing of this was actually an understanding of the local intricacies of the conflict, and I think that's very important to know.
May I add to that?
Yes.
So I think there was, you asked why the referendum came afterwards, not before. I mean, there were elections to the Northern Ireland Forum, so people were able to elect the parties that then took part in the talks. And for example, in the case of the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition, that wasn't an established political party, but the women decided that they wanted to form a party so they could be part of the talks. And they did it on a different basis. It wasn't representing one community or the other, it was cross-community. So there was, and I think there still is in Northern Ireland, this very strong civil society involvement in the peace process, and indeed since the agreement in trying to build peace. Civil society is very active. And for me, that's, when we think about peace processes, we often say, well, they've got to be between, the people involved have got to be the combatants or the people who are parties to the conflict, and that's correct. And obviously, it was a big change in Northern Ireland when the combatants became involved in the peace process. But it's also important to have civil society there, because they represent the majority who don't want this conflict, as Peter has said, and those people need to have a voice too, so that you don't end up with a deal that just suits the combatants, but that actually is something that serves the wider constituency of the people living in the place.
And actually, that leads me to the next question that I wanted to ask you. You also mentioned in the first part that this inclusiveness was also one of the preconditions for the agreement. So I would now like that we make a new step. So we have the agreement, and it lasts for 25 years. What do you see as the main reasons why this agreement succeeded to be maintained, because I don't believe that agreements maintain themselves, to be maintained for the 25 years and to be, if we went back to what David said, successful in a way? Who are the key players?
So, the agreement itself, so I think this agreement was very creative insofar as it found ways of addressing some of the issues that were where both sides made concessions. I mean, Peter has referred to the change in the Irish constitution to remove the claim to the territory of Northern Ireland. You know, the principle of consent was established and balanced with the principle of self-determination. So it found ways, both sides had to move, but it found ways of, creative ways of giving the parties what they wanted, but not everything, obviously, that they wanted. And so it became, what has happened is that, what should happen is that people can express their political aspirations through the political process. And the political process perhaps hasn't been 100% a success in Northern Ireland, because I think the institutions have been not sitting longer than they've been sitting, if I'm right. But there is a political means of expressing people's aspirations, either to stay part of the union with the United Kingdom or to join Ireland. But I mean, when you go to Northern Ireland, I know you've been there, it's also very clear that a lot of people work every day to keep this agreement a success. And that Northern Ireland has a huge constituency of people who work for peace at the local level. And, you know, breaking down tensions, building relationships, forming relationships across the community divide. So the people who work for this agreement are still there and are still very active. I should also say, because we haven't mentioned it yet, that both before and after the agreement, we had a lot of help from our international partners, so which I think was important. So the agreement itself, I think, came from, you know, came from the views of the parties, and it came from the ideas that had been developed before in the proceedings.
Can you just be more specific? What kind of help do you think? What kind of support that you think that really contributed from the international actors and friends that actually contributed to this?
So we had four main international partners. So we had the US, Canada, Finland, and South Africa, and they all did slightly different things. So with the US, Senator George Mitchell chaired the talks, and he, from what I've read, as I said, I was not there, but it sounds as though he was very skilled in listening to the parties and then producing proposals based on what they had said. But he was also a very good convener. So, you know, he knew when to push, he set deadlines, he set a deadline, you know, in fact, the agreement was really done very quickly because he set a deadline. He said he was going back to the United States, and he kind of forced the issue. President Clinton, I think, also played a huge role in kind of persuading the parties to make an agreement. And then General Sir John de Chastelain and the Finns, Martti Ahtisaari, played a huge role in the decommissioning, which was a very controversial issue. And after the agreement was made, they had these many years of decommissioning. I mean, the British press was dominated by this decommissioning issue for years, so putting the weapons out of use. And there were some creative ideas that I think came from the Finns on how to do that. And then I also want to mention the South Africans, because I think they played an important role. In 1997, they invited all the parties to the talks on a visit to South Africa. And I think it was probably one of the, I'm going to be corrected by my colleagues, but it was maybe one of the first opportunities for the parties to get to know each other a little bit and to start to see each other as human beings rather than as the enemy. And also I think they were inspired by the example of President Mandela, who'd really overcome, you know, the worst kind of adverse troubles and the worst kind of divisions, and gave them an example of how you could approach conflict in a different way. And so, you know, it wasn't, the agreement was definitely not imposed by international partners. It wasn't, you know, it wasn't that the Americans said you have to do this. It was a sort of bottom-up agreement. But this facilitation and encouragement role that we had from international partners was really important.
Thank you for this very, very valuable insight. And David, I would like to hear actually what do you think, but also I would like, if you can, of course, to emphasize what made the peace process that was established by the agreement fragile. What were the challenges this agreement faced? during these 25 years? Was there a moment when anyone was afraid that maybe this can disrupt everything that we achieved?
Well, yeah, just before I start to echo what Peter and Sally have said, I mean, one of the crucial preconditions for peace is that the people wanted peace. The vast majority of people had no time for violence, were opposed to it across the political spectrum. The second point that has to be emphasized was the huge contribution of the international community, particularly United States, European Union, and other countries, South Africa, Canada. The fragility of the process, there are still residual elements, if you like, on the extremes who would like to go back to violence and occasionally make efforts to create a situation whereby they might provoke violence. But these are very much on the extreme. They're isolated groups. Effectively, the end to violence has held. The fragility of the process, what the Good Friday Agreement tried to do was to try to clarify the constitutional situation. Unfortunately, everything in politics in Northern Ireland tends to come back to the constitutional situation. What the Good Friday Agreement did was that on the part of the Irish government and nationalism, it recognised that Northern Ireland was part of the United Kingdom, is part of the United Kingdom, which was not the case under the Irish constitution at that time. Ireland amended its constitution on the back of the referendum to remove that claim to sovereignty over Northern Ireland, that Northern Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom unless and until the majority of people in Northern Ireland and also the Republic decide otherwise. So basically what they tried to do was park that and then enable a situation where people across the community could involve themselves in the governance of the place, Northern Ireland, and even getting people to agree to call this place Northern Ireland is more difficult than it seems. There are still many people who will refer to the north of Ireland, even the 6 counties rather than Northern Ireland. But enabling them one way or the other to involve themselves in the governance of the place that they call home. Unfortunately, this situation has been repeatedly disrupted by the eruption of the national issue onto the agenda. The other factor that has caused this, and this is something that has a read across to other peace processes, is that you will see consistently in this kind of situation that when there is violence, people will vote for moderates. When the violence stops, they will drift back to the extremes. I mean, you see that here. 20 years ago, I came to Serbia. I think it was maybe still the Republic of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia at that time. I met a very senior member of the government, I won't name them to save them, who said to me quite out, yes, we recognize that Kosovo has gone and it's not coming back. You won't get a member of the government 20 years on today to say that. So, you know, people have drifted back to the extremes once violence has ceased. That has happened in Northern Ireland. So you now have representing as the main parties on both the nationalist and unionist side, parties that were on the extreme at the time of the negotiations. On the unionist side, a party that wasn't even in the negotiations when the Good Friday Agreement was concluded, because they had opted out when Sinn Féin came in. So this is a constant struggle, trying to overcome the constitutional question that is continually out there, and in a way that enables politicians to focus on the good governance, to building a prosperous, wholesome, peaceful society. And unfortunately, as I said, Brexit has, while it was...
I just wanted to ask for...
Well, it was a democratic decision of the British people. That cannot be gainsaid. from my perspective, it was a disaster, both in terms of Northern Ireland and for the country of my birth. But I'm not expecting Sally to comment on that. But obviously the whole outworkings.
But did Brexit situation challenge the agreement or not?
Well, it did challenge the agreement in a couple of ways. What people tend to overlook is that the Good Friday Agreement was founded upon common membership of the European Union. A great deal of what removed barriers on the island of Ireland was not a result of the Good Friday Agreement, but was a result of our common membership of the European Union. And believe me, issues are much easier to resolve when both parties are a member of the European Union. In fact, common membership of the European Union was an enormous breakthrough in British-Irish relations because we joined the EU at the same time, or the EEC at the same time, and we were two Anglophone voices around the table in a community that was still very much Francophone. It brought ministers, civil servants together in a way that enabled us to develop bilateral relations which were fundamental to breaking through the barriers of historical mistrust that existed. So there was the common membership of the EU, but then with Brexit, with the attempt to try and maintain the freedom of movement on the island, freedom of trade, it made it more difficult in terms of relation. Where does Northern Ireland stand in the UK? Unionists have claimed, hang on, these new arrangements mean that we're not fully part of the UK anymore because we have these special arrangements to allow for trade on an all-island basis. So it's an impossible effort to square the circle. It's quite clear from the British government's reaction to, say, the Windsor Framework that they consider the job is done, that the wider interests of the UK must prevail. But there is still a concern amongst unionists that somehow they are no longer fully part of the UK. And I think we're expecting in a matter of days, I think, maybe some attempt by the British government to try and reassure unionists that their concerns have been met. But whatever way it works out, it's not going to be perfect from either perspective.
Thank you, Peter. I maybe have an additional question for you, and that is, like, 25 years after the agreement, are there any parts of the agreement and things that were agreed, but that during these 25 years turned out not to be so good? Or everything was amazing?
It depends who you ask. I think one of the first things is just to go back very, very quickly. The money that came from the European Union after 1998, the peace monies, it, for example, allowed Stormont to be politicians. What did you do with the other people who were in that organization? So significant money, for example, was spent upon prisoner groups. So you kept the management of the peace process within the actual structures of the paramilitary organizations, although they were illegal, but it was a de facto operating in plain sight. And they were important because they were pushing the peace process. You were able to use that European Union money to do a lot of oral history of the Troubles. So people felt that they had their say, and you would have had that inter-community contact where, for example, the policeman's widow would have met with somebody who was in the IRA. And that was very important because there was a lot of healing around that. So we actually created a social peace building structure. And I think that's one of the reasons why our peace process has been so successful. Sorry, what was the question again? I was rambling there.
The question was actually, are there any parts of the agreements that during these 25 years turned out not to be so good?
Oh, well, the obvious one is the way in which to guarantee that the assembly would function initially, we have this capacity for a political party to stop legislation, and that's based upon a sectarian headcount, basically. So you have a situation that, for example, marriage equality, the vast majority of members of the Northern Ireland Assembly supported marriage equality, LGBT rights, for example. But the DUP were able to stop that because of the voting mechanisms in the Assembly. So you have this peculiar situation that 60% of members can agree on a law or a piece of legislation, and one political party that's in the executive can stop that. And I think one of the things that we have found in the survey work we have done is the vast majority of the people of Northern Ireland want that to go. So that safety mechanism, that no political party could dominate the Assembly, it needs to be looked at. And especially it needs to be looked at now because, as I said earlier, 20% of voters are not voting for constitutional parties. And I think there's another point as well. The Assembly is incredibly, the Northern Ireland Assembly is incredibly unattractive amongst young people. In Northern Ireland, we have seen a post-conflict generation which is not interested in the issues that are being discussed in the Assembly, so victims' issues, issues to do with the Constitution. You actually find when you do surveys that younger people don't have an opinion on the constitutional question. They're quite benign about it. And of course, they're the beneficiaries of the new economy and living in a much more secure place. And I think, you know, if you talk about generations of peacemaking, one of the problems is that we created an electoral system which rewards constitutional ethnic tribune parties. It allows them to control policy making in a way which is not reflective of the mood in Northern Ireland. So if we do a survey and we ask people, you know, do you support gay rights? The majority of Protestants, Catholics and non-believers support gay rights. If you ask a question about abortion, the majority of people, Catholic, Protestant, and neither are supporting abortion. When those things go to the Assembly, one political party can stop the progress of, you know, of society. And I think that's one of the downfalls. It was designed to ensure no dominance, but what they didn't factor in was that there was going to be rapid social change in Northern Irish society. And one of the things that's really, really clear now is the younger generation are incredibly social liberal. They do not respond to the thinking of previous generations. And they look at the Assembly and they see these people who were involved in the conflict who are still hanging about and who are not delivering the modern type of society in which they want to live.
I would just want to stay a little bit more with that part about the younger generation, and if I understood correctly, the fact that they, in a way, don't care about these historical divisions, how it was fixed. They have now their own future and probably their own way how they envision that future should look like. Do you think that strengthens the peace process or not?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to understand is since 1998, Northern Ireland is a small place. Since 1998, around 200,000 people have joined the electoral register. So the majority of those people will be those who reach the age of 18. If you look at that in terms of electoral performance, a third of that new electorate has voted for non-constitutional parties, and around about 20% has voted for constitutional parties, and a very, very significant share increasingly have not voted at all. And I think one of the things is that, you know, what we talked about earlier on was civic society was very well organised against the conflict, whereas amongst that younger generation who live together, socialise together, work together. I'm not trying to create like Northern Ireland's utopia. Of course, there's issues, but the transition in, like, I'll give you an example. When I was young, I played rugby. You know, there were no Catholics on the rugby team. When my son played rugby, there were Catholics, Muslims. You know, there was a kid from Zimbabwe. He grew up in a very, very different environment. I was nearly killed 7 or 8 times in the Troubles. My son and my daughter never witnessed any violence. So it's not that they don't care about the past, but the past is represented in a binary way, and their lives are not binary. And I think that's the thing that is the slow burner, the river that goes under the ground, that is actually changing Northern Irish society. You know, you take the Alliance Party, the non-constitutional party. it has gone from around about 5% of the vote to now around 17%. Like, that's a massive transition in a very short time. And why are young people doing that? Because at the end of the day, what really matters to them is delayed adulthood. But, you know, I'm sure it's the same where you are. You know, young people can't afford to get on the property market. It's to do with they're working in skilled jobs. They are, you know, Belfast used to be boarded up. It was empty. It is now like a small, sophisticated European city. You know, the way in which they socialise has changed, and the whole thing that has changed dramatically is they live together, they socialise together, and it's only in the even in the hard edge communities. You know, when we did surveys in 1998 in around the time of the peace process, the main concern of young people in deprived communities was actually fear of the other side, violence from the other community. That is now bottom of the list. The concern in those areas is drugs. It is family function. It is the actual problems that you would have in London or Glasgow or Dublin are their concern. So, you know, I think what's really important also to understand is all of these things we're talking about will rarely ever get onto the Northern Irish media. The Northern Irish media is one of the fundamental problems we have. It will not engage with the positives of the peace process. It, on a daily basis, has binary arguments. They bring in the same people to have the same conversation about, and that answers your question. Why do young people not engage with the media? Because it's talking about something that is not relevant to their lives.
Thank you. And now I would actually, since we covered different aspects, we covered the part before the agreement itself, different challenges and successes of the agreement now, but we also managed to actually shed light on some differences, and at one point it was mentioned the part that each conflict is very special and that we should not copy-paste the solution or somehow try to find the perfect solution for our problem in some other solution. But still, that doesn't mean that we should not somehow learn more about it, analyze it, and see maybe what are the similarities in the situation, and maybe use the same tactics or methods that were used before. So, Sally, do you see how do you see the extent of transferability of the Good Friday Agreement and that process that Northern Ireland went through together with Ireland and UK in a way? How do you see it for maybe some other conflict situations across the world? What would you point out?
So I think there are elements of the Northern Ireland peace process that can inspire. I mean, it's never going to be a model because it's the situation in Northern Ireland was very specific. But there are some things that can perhaps inspire in the way that the Northern Ireland process was inspired by processes elsewhere. So one thing I would say is this idea that a peace process is quite a long thing, and that it's not one moment in time. It's something that, you know, the Northern Ireland process started in the 70s, and arguably it's still going on. But there was, after the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, there was the St Andrews Agreement, and, you know, now there's this attempt by the British government to deal with the past, which was not dealt with in the agreement itself, partly perhaps because people didn't realise that the conflict was going to come to an end. They hoped that, but they didn't know it.
Yeah, and the agreement basically only dealt with the systematic discrimination that was implemented. Yeah. It referred a little bit of that part, and basically with the political prisoners and the combatants.
But it didn't deal with the past, and so now there's been, actually ever since the agreement, there's been this attempt to find a way of dealing with the past, and there's a bill that the British government put to Parliament that is still trying to do that. But so I would say one thing is it's a long process. Don't expect it all to happen in one set of talks. You know, maybe each set of talks identify an element that can be carried forward. That's one thing. I think the inclusiveness is really important. So, you know, the fact there were elected representatives to the multi-party talks, that civil society was there. In our thinking, as I said earlier, in our thinking about peace processes, we you know, sometimes we don't even include the combatants. And obviously you have to, if you want people to renounce violence, you have to include them in the talks so that they renounce violence, because it's the combatants that need to renounce violence. But talks also need to be broader than that. They need to involve the constituencies who haven't been violent, who don't want violence, and who want a different future. So that's an important part of it. I would also say, you know, using your international support. So again, a kind of common maybe pitfall of peace processes is if you have outsiders writing agreements that are not rooted in what the parties are saying. It's really important that you have the right sort of international support, that it's support but not directing a process, and so that it's listening to you know, to the positions of the parties, looking for where they might shift, but also directing them to a certain extent, directing the process. So encouraging compromise, encouraging the finding of common ground, encouraging people to form relationships with each other. So maybe these are just a few things that I could mention that, you know, that perhaps are applicable more broadly.
Yeah, and actually I was, for me it was very curious to learn that even the dairy model, in a way, how people in dairy dealt with their dealing with the past or peace-building process is very different than from Belfast, for example. So for me, even these differences were very interesting, and that actually leads me to my next question. In a way, and maybe David, you can help me to understand it better, because my impression from Belfast was that realities are still divided there among the citizens. That those walls and graffitis and the way how people actually live their daily life, I think that these barriers that existed before, many of the things have been somehow overcome, but they can be sensed in a way. Do you think that that's good enough? I'm interested to hear your opinion. Do you think that that's okay? That if that maintains peace, that should be left like that, or there should be more efforts invested into overcoming the legacy of the trouble?
Oh, okay. Would you mind if I just pick up a little here, because I think there are a couple of things worth saying in terms of relevance of the Northern Ireland process for the situation in this part of the world. I mean, the theme underlying a lot of discussions in this conference so far, as I see it, is the whole process of the integration of the Western Balkans area into the European Union. And that's not just a question of accession. That's also, to some extent, a parallel peace process, because there is so much division between the countries concerned. One thing that was absolutely essential, and the two governments were very determined on it, is that we would not let the enemies of the peace process dictate the pace of the peace process or derail the process. Now, we all know that there are forces out there with a great deal of influence and a very long reach who will do whatever they can to undermine the integration of the Western Balkans into the European Union. And they are external players. The question is, what is the attitude of internal players, internal elites? If every time there is an event, and we had them in Northern Ireland, violence, killings, murders, I mean, a considerable number of people were killed by paramilitaries during the negotiations.
Exactly.
And, you know, there was always pressure to stop, to expel parties, to have nothing more to do with it, which the governments resisted. The question that has to be established by people who can establish these things are, who is behind these events? Are these rogue or maverick elements in political elites here that are involved? Are they actually the leaders of the elites, and that is the way you have to look at it. But if every time something happens, you kind of you overturn the table and say, right, we've got to stop, we can't go on with this, then you will basically be handing a veto to the enemies of the process. So there will always be people who will call immediately for sanctions or expulsions or whatever. But you have to take a very measured and considered approach to this, and that's where the international community, the leading players, the EU, United States, UK, and others have to take a very considered view on this. You can't just stop negotiating and moving forward just because there are people out there who are trying to prevent you from doing so, especially if they're external actors. As I said, if you find fundamentally that these are the key internal players who are trying to disrupt the process, then you have to draw conclusions from that. The other point I would make on that score is on identity. One of the most significant successes of the Good Friday Agreement was the understanding that people in Northern Ireland could be identified as being British, Irish, or both, and that they can hold passports, British, Irish passports, or both. And you will see that reflected in the census levels. These things are done much more easily when you're in the European Union, because then you have a common EU citizenship with its own rights and obligations. Having a passport of one EU country rather than the passport of another EU country is easier, if you like. I mean, what we have seen, it was mentioned the situation in Hungary at one of the sessions I was at yesterday, where, when Hungary extended its citizenship laws, that a lot of people sought to avail of Hungarian citizenship as a means of being able to live in the EU. Since Brexit, we've seen a huge upsurge in applications for Irish passports from people who would have previously had British passports and frankly still probably retain both, but it's become a passport of convenience. That's not really what it was about. It was about trying to have a looser control of, if you like, identity issues. I've talked too long, so I'll give.
Yeah, but maybe I will now give the floor to Peter and repeat this part about the present, so we can actually conclude this panel because we have a little time. I think I'm not sure what this means.
It is never a good idea to ask somebody from Northern Ireland to be quick.
Well, basically, can you just reflect a little bit before we go to questions about this divided realities? Are there things that can be improved?
In areas of previously high conflict in Northern Ireland, we have walls that basically separate Protestant and Catholic areas. 25 years ago, the average number of violent events related to the walls was about 150 per ward per electoral district. The highest now is 15. Now, what's actually happened is, although the walls are very obscene and they show a failure of politics, the interaction across the walls is massive now. So you wouldn't have gone to the leisure centre or the gym on the other side, you wouldn't have gone to the bar on the other side, you wouldn't have gone to the restaurant on the other side. We didn't have a restaurant. But you wouldn't have gone to the other side. When I was a kid, I grew up beside a wall, and the first time I was in the community that was 20 metres away was when I was 18. Now, movement across those walls now is very common. People shop in each other's areas, people consume in each other's areas. So although the walls are a signifier of a failed politics, the mobility around the walls today actually shows the success of people. Because what's really important, and I think what people need to understand, is you don't sort peace processes out at a negotiating table, and you don't deliver peace through parliament. What you do achieve in terms of stability is the social peace building aspect. It is the aspect in which you let people have a say over the peace process, and also what's really, really important is you let people become agents of the peace process. And that, when we go back to the question about external funding.
And can we now, sorry Peter for interrupting you, but can we now stop there with people being the agents of the peace process, and maybe open the floor for the questions and collect them, and then we can shortly try to answer them. Okay, we have 1, 2, 3. We can collect them all.
Yes, thank you. Very interesting panel. My name's Ivor Chipkin. I'm from South Africa. Interesting, at the time of the South African transition, I was involved in trying to not export, but bring the model of the South African reconciliation into the Israeli-Palestine situation by engaging with the PLO in this regard. There was something around the preconditions which I wanted to think around. David Cooney, you mentioned that you kept raising, well, you raised it, this question of the national question, as you framed it. And what was interesting about the South African moment, which has been increasingly repudiated in South Africa as well, was this idea of non-racialism, which essentially said that under certain circumstances, it is possible for there to resolve a conflict by integrating combatants in a situation where there's fundamental division in society and fundamental, the long violent history between parties. It seems to me that is a key understanding which emerged at a particular historical moment, which has been repudiated both in South Africa, but increasingly around the world, a growing nationalism, which makes this idea of plural societies more and more difficult to think around. And I wonder if that question is not so fundamental to the Northern Ireland situation, and whether it wouldn't be fundamental, therefore, to Kosovo and also to Israel-Palestine as well.
Thank you. Now we have more here. Here we have 2.
Okay. Thank you for the panel. It was very interesting to hear, especially in the situation of actually having the unresolved conflicts in Serbia. So my name is Jovana Spremo. I'm Advocacy Director of Lawyers Committee for Human Rights, and I will have a very quick question. Mr. Cooney, you mentioned actually that we should not let the enemies of the peace process influence the reaching of the agreement. But the question is actually how to reach the agreement if the enemies of the process are the negotiators in the process. So what could the citizens and the civil society actually do in this kind of situation to push for reaching the good agreement in these kind of unfortunate situations?
Okay. Not there.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation. It was really interesting. My name is Una Kelly. I work for the EU delegation here in Belgrade. One of the areas I covered is reconciliation and transitional justice. I have a question for Peter in relation to the statistics that you gave on awareness of the troubles in Northern Ireland. You talked about this huge difference that was taken in terms of the victims, that, in the period, I think, around the agreement and now much more recent. It was like a 40% increase in awareness, which I think is a positive thing. So we finance surveys here in Serbia, awareness of the conflicts that took place during Yugoslavia. And what we found in the surveys, there was a 4-year difference, is the lack of awareness and the increasing, let's say, ignorance of what happened to all sides, okay? So my question to you, Peter, and I have another question as well, is how did you address that gap? How did you improve the awareness to know that there was difficulty on all sides and victims on all sides? And my second question is to the panel, to the members of the panel, is in light of this, who, and the fact that also you've mentioned also, Peter, the lack of interest of the youth in Northern Ireland, and I think it's a global issue that youth across the world are not interested in post-conflict issues. So my question is, who do you work with? I think it's a nice follow-on to Jovana's question. Who do we work with to, address reconciliation and addressing the past that you said was so important, also financed by the EU in Northern Ireland? Thank you very much.
Thank you. There.
Thank you. My name is Olivier Heiner. I'm a fellow of the Geneva Center for Security Policy. And among other things, I spent 7 years in northern Kosovo. And I wanted to thank you very much for the very inspiring insights in the debate. 2 points that struck me in the insights that you shared with us is first the inclusivity of the process you described in Northern Ireland. And the second thing is the multi-party dimension of it. And when I look at the current dialogue, the Brussels dialogue, bringing together Serbia and Kosovo, I'm struck by the following things. First, in my opinion, the lack of inclusivity of the communities. We feel a big distance between each government and their own community. And at the same time, the process is, in my opinion, very far away from both communities. So that's one point. The second point is, it's, in my opinion, not very much a multi-party process. So it's bringing the governments together, but not the parties. And thirdly, my impression is that it's a very much outside-driven process. The impetus comes from outside, not from inside and the communities. So on the basis of your experience, what would be your advice or thoughts to stimulate both the inclusiveness, and especially of communities, and by the way, not only civil society, but really the communities, the people who don't speak English, who don't know each other, who don't have a job, and so on. And secondly, on this multi-party, what would be your advice to stimulate multi-party involvement in the process? Thank you.
Thank you. And the last one was there.
Reinhard Priebe, I've worked for quite a long time in the European Commission. Not surprisingly, in the Brexit negotiation, Northern Ireland was probably the most difficult issue, leading to an endless and very complicated North Ireland protocol, trying to square the circle and having both Northern Ireland in a certain way in the internal market and having Northern Ireland part of the British market. Do you think that the solution which has been found for Northern Ireland in Brexit will be sustainable, or is there a risk of further destabilization because of the result of Brexit?
Thank you. There, one more.
This is Birgül Demirtaş, Turkish-German University, Istanbul. There are many conflicts in the world, and from time to time we have peace processes in many of these conflicts. But most of these peace processes are not either are not being concluded, or even if they are being concluded, they are not sustainable. It is mainly because of the fact that there are certain groups, certain circles who benefit from the maintenance of the violent conflict. They have material or political interests. When you have enemies out there, you can win the next elections, or you can get different material benefits as well. I mean, how did you break that kind of, the monopoly of these groups in the Irish case? You mentioned that the governments in the United Kingdom and Ireland, they did not let these violent groups, to take the upper hand. But how was it possible? I mean, how was it achieved in the Northern Ireland case, but how couldn't we achieve it, for example, in the Middle East or in other parts of the world? Why are these groups that have the arms in their hands, how could they prevent the conclusion of the peace agreements? Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for this question. I think that we got a lot of questions, but I think that all of them are somehow very connected, and then actually with one answer you can cover several aspects. So maybe we can start like this and try to be as short as possible.
Yeah. So maybe I'll address one or two of them. I mean, on the nationalism issue, I mean, as I said, I think the Belfast Good Friday Agreement was really creative because it allowed for people to have more than one sort of identity. So it kind of recognised the reality of the situation in Northern Ireland, and it, it did allow people to have Irish and British passports. Everybody's allowed that, and it tried to sort of take some of the tension out of this issue. And as Peter said, I think since the agreement, there is obviously this growth of the middle ground. I know that you think that, I think David thinks that there's been polarisation, but there's also been the growth of the alliance party, so the people who just don't identify with these kind of community-based politics. So I think that was something that maybe, would be an interesting thing to look at for the situation here, how you can sort of take some of the tension out of this nationality issue. On what the citizens can do, I mean, one of the things that struck me reading about the Northern Ireland peace process was I think the sort of citizen demand for a peace process or for peace was an important part of it. So, there were women's marches saying that they just didn't want this violence anymore. I think after one of the killings, I think it was by the IRA, the fiancé of the person killed, really engaged with the IRA to say, to kind of confront them and say, we don't want this. And so the people who are against violence, I think, have to make their voices heard. And in the end, politicians respond to public pressure. So I would say that was an important thing. And then the last question from the Turkish journalists was
basically how that can, basically it's about the transfer also of the knowledge, how the successes from Northern Ireland can be also somehow transferred to the other regions in a way. Yeah. And what would be the lessons that you would like to share that could enable this transfer?
Yeah, and I think you said, some peace processes never really come to an end, and that, the people who don't want peace, and it was about the violence, people who have an interest in the violence.
And how to actually deal with the people who are against peace, in a way.
I mean, this is a challenge. So obviously, in a peace agreement, parties have to see that they get something that they want. So, the Sinn Féin, you could argue, saw that it got a constitutional route to its political objectives, which meant that it could fight its cause through politics rather than through violence. So that was part of it. I mean, there are people who have a vested interest in conflict, and I think, I'm sure Peter would have something to say about this, but it's not that Northern Ireland is without violence. It's just a bit of it's more criminal violence now than political violence, and I think that goes to the question of economic development. Although Northern Ireland is transformed, as Peter said, it's very different now to how it was 25 years ago or 30 years ago. But there are still challenges around development, and I think the people who feel excluded are the people who are often economically excluded as well. So it's really important, to focus on the sort of economic development as a way of sort of embedding peace. And I know the European Union's done a lot of work and a lot of funding in that regard.
And David, I would really like you to take over this question. What happens if the enemies of the process are navigating the process?
Okay, yeah. First of all, just to clarify, when I say about the drift to extremism, what I was saying was that the two parties that were responsible essentially for the agreement on both sides of the community, on either side of the community, have subsequently been eclipsed by parties on the extreme. I don't deny what Peter is saying about the growth of a more middle ground, and particularly amongst younger people. So just to be clear on that. We were very lucky with the peace process in Northern Ireland, that we had two governments working in the same direction, both who were resolutely opposed to violence. We had almost universal support for the peace process from the international community. The exception of maybe Gaddafi's Libya, who was supplying arms to the IRA, but basically the whole international community was on our side. That isn't the case here in the Western Balkans. As regards, I don't know what the situation here is as regards the elites and who is involved and who is not involved. There are people who and countries who have more sophisticated means of establishing that than I do. I will say that I listened to Ambassador Hill, the US ambassador here yesterday. I thought he was brilliant. I'd sign up to everything he said. But he did try to make allowances for politicians being politicians. Sometimes when you're in an academic or NGO forum, you know, people rightly have very strong views about what is right and what is wrong and what should happen. But politicians have to lead. And a politician that looks over their shoulder and sees there's no one behind them is no use to anybody. So a politician has to bring their community with them, and that was something that was very clear in the Good Friday Agreement. I don't know whether some of the things that are said and done, whether they're just posturing, whether they're necessary. As I said, I'm not in a position to judge that. If that is the case, that the leaders are genuinely against the process, then I can't see any solution other than electing different leaders. But that's not for me to decide. That's for the electorates of these countries to decide.
And I would now go to Peter. So Peter, please, if you can address, I think that one question was specifically for you.
I suppose the answer to the question is, you know, you need to know more about Northern Ireland, and I think there's quite a lot of material out there that would help people in other societies. Of course, you can't have a facsimile, you can't take a peace process and put it down somewhere. But let's think about it this way. You know, the wreckers and the spoilers, those who do not wish for there to be peace. The Sinn Féin made it very clear before the Good Friday Agreement that they would never accept Northern Ireland as part of the UK. They did. They maintained the legitimacy for violence, which they stopped. They said they would never sit in a devolved assembly, which they did. And I think one of the things you have to realise about Northern Ireland is that the process of peace building was long term, because when David mentioned earlier on about civil rights issues, most of those issues have been resolved during the conflict, if not at the start of the conflict. I think there's another important question, is this: I've rarely met a combatant who wants to be engaged in violence. Most people I have met who are combatants do not wish. They feel that circumstances compel them into violence. I think the vast majority of people I've interacted with would never have been in prison, would never have engaged in violence if it hadn't been for the complex situation in the society in which they lived. So the question is, you know, that there's a point of pressure. You know, do you really want to bring another generation through this conflict? Do you really want to risk your life? Do you really want to risk the lives of others? And I think sometimes those big universal questions are actually very important. But I think one of the things that is critically important is to echo what David is saying. You must put pressure on politicians to change. You know, one of the characteristics of the Good Friday Agreement was there was an enthusiasm for change. And this was articulated. This is when the media was doing a good job, because the media was actually locating the voices that were calling for change. And I think what's important here is the point I made earlier. You're not going to have a sustainable peace process unless you have social peace building. The politicians need to be affected by what they see in the ground. And one of the situations in Northern Ireland, when politicians started to see that people were engaging across the sectarian divide, when they saw that business people were coming together to build, you know, jobs and investment, that actually spooked them, because the politics that they had used of separation was breaking down, because people felt secure, but also through the money from Europe, people were actually able to live the life they wanted to live, which was an inter-community life, not a life that was based upon separation.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I know that we spent much more time than it was supposed to, but I believe that we raised some very important topics, particularly in this current context where we have conflicts emerging all around the world. So I believe that a lot of valuable lessons have been shared. Thank you.
Thank you.